My name is Jeff. My wife is Mary. We're missionaries in Thailand, and it's a great honor for us to be here today. This is actually the first time we've had a chance to come and visit the church and everybody here, so we're pretty excited about it. Today, I'll let you know up front that I have a message to preach today, but at the end, we'll have things a little bit differently, as I have a video that kind of shows a little bit about. It'll relate to the message a little bit, but then also it's going to show a little bit about the work that we're doing in Thailand. And then I think afterwards there's questions and stuff. So, so I have a message today that I'm going to preach out of the book of Matthew, chapter 14. I've heard this message preached many times before, and usually when you hear it, it's a common one. Everybody knows it that's been in the church usually. They've heard it since they were in Sunday school. And the time, it's about Jesus walking on the water. And so many times as I've heard this, I've always heard it from the perspective of Peter. And Peter walking on the water, and if Peter just had a little bit more faith, then he wouldn't have sunk. If he would have kept his eyes on Jesus, he wouldn't have sunk. And that's great. It's a good message. I think it's true, but I want to focus this one just a little bit differently. Rather than having it primarily from the focus of Peter, I wanted to focus from the perspective of Jesus. So I'm going to read for you, and I'm not always a very good reader, so I'm sorry, I apologize in advance. But we're going to read from Matthew chapter 14. I'm going to start in verse 22, and I'm going to read down to the end of the chapter. And I was asked for slides to be able to help you guys so you can read it on the screen, and I didn't get it here in time. So, all right, so I'm reading out of this is called the Legacy Standard Bible, so if it's a little bit different from what you guys are used to, if it's too different, just know that mine's correct. And the Legacy is kind of like a newer version of like New American Standard, so it's not. But anyways, verse 22. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side while he sent the crowds away. And after he sent the crowds away, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. And when it was evening, he was there alone. But the boat was already many stadia away from the land, being battered by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. Now when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, and they said, "It's a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered and said to him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come out to you on the water." And he said, "Come." And getting out of the boat, Peter walked on the water and came towards Jesus. But seeing the wind, he became frightened, and he began to sink. And he cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and took hold of him and said, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind stopped. And those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "You truly are God's Son." And when they crossed over and came to the land of Gerasenet, and when the men of that place recognized him, they sent word to all of the surrounding districts and brought to him all who were sick. And they were pleading with him that they might just touch the fringe of his garment, and as many as would touched it were healed. All right, before we get into this too far, I want to do some background setting. Okay? At this particular time, what happened just prior to Jesus putting his disciples into the boat was the feeding of the 5,000. Okay? Now, at this time, the disciples, there was an idea that people had about who Jesus was, but at this point in history, they were still kind of trying to figure out exactly who Jesus was. They knew that he was a man of God. They didn't question that he was sent from God, but there just was something that was there that they didn't expect that was coming out of Jesus. In fact, if we go back, we have to go back to Matthew chapter 11. We'll see what John the Baptist had to say about it. John the Baptist was quoted by Jesus as being one of the best men that ever lived. No one was born of woman that was greater than John the Baptist. Now, John the Baptist was waiting for the Messiah. And when he heard about what Jesus was doing, he sent a message to Jesus from his disciples. And in chapter 11, verse 2 and 3, this is what he said. Now when John in prison heard the words of Christ, he sent word by his disciples and said, "Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for somebody else?" So my point here is that even John the Baptist, when he was looking at the works and the miracles that Jesus was performing, had something in the back of his mind saying, is this the Messiah that we're supposed to be waiting for? We know he's from Christ. We know he's from God, but we don't know exactly. And the reason for that is because everyone during the day thought that Jesus was going to come as a conqueror. He was going to come as a ruler. He was going to kick Rome out, and he was going to reestablish Jerusalem as its own nation, free from tyranny. And so when Jesus was coming in and the works that he was doing, they knew that he was from God. They just didn't quite match up to their preconceived ideas. Then, following this, if you go back to chapter 14, we see that Jesus hears in chapter 14, he gets word that John the Baptist was beheaded. And so you can imagine that the people that are there, the disciples that have heard this is Jesus' cousin. He had questions about the Messiah. And then now this other pillar of the faith just was beheaded by the government. And so their faith is a little bit shattered or a little bit rattled, just not sure what's going on. And so now we're going back to verse 22. Now, I have a question for you. In Thailand, most of the stuff that I do is in teaching format, not so much in preaching format. And there is a difference. In teaching, I let people talk. So if I ask a question and somebody says the answer, that's great. If you don't know the answer, that's okay too. I'll point it out and make fun of you. No. Okay, so from our perspective, our vantage point, we know that Jesus Christ is who? These are easy answers, not tricky. Sorry? Son of God, which means that he is the Messiah, which means he is both God and man, right? So when Jesus is here after he feeds the 5,000 and he is getting ready to put the disciples into the boat, what does he already know about the lake? That there's going to be a storm. But he put them in there anyways, right? Now, if you look at the very beginning portions of verse 22, it says, immediately after this, okay, the 5,000, immediately he made, I looked it up, it is a command, made his disciples get into the boat. And he didn't get in there with them and sent them off. I can explain it to her. Well, those are the kinds of questions I would like if I was teaching. So, yeah, that's a perfect avenue. So we have Jesus putting his disciples into the boat and then sending them off into the storm, right? A little while later, Jesus comes walking to them on the water. Now, the next question that I have is this. Has anybody here ever been in a boat? Okay, has anyone been in a boat in water? Okay, good. Now we'll a little bit further. In a boat in a big body of water. Okay. Now, has anyone ever been in a boat in a big body of water and a storm? Okay. Now, has anybody been in a boat in a big body of water in a storm and said, "Let me get out and walk on the water"? Okay. I haven't had anybody yet say that they wanted to. Okay. So my point here is that Peter, when he sees that Jesus is walking on the water, they all cry out saying that he's a ghost. He says, "No, it's not a ghost, it's me." And Peter says, "If it's really you, let me come out to you." And then he gets out of the boat and starts walking, right? Now that's a big step of, I did it again. I have a stopwatch. Every service I ever preach, I get it ready and I'm going to push it, and I didn't push it. So now my time starts. So... and it's genuinely unintentional every time. But anyways, Peter gets out of the boat and starts to walk to Christ on the water. Now, if you ask me, I probably wouldn't have been the one that said, "You know what, let me jump into the boat and see if I can walk." In my opinion, yeah, I know you would. You're crazy. In my opinion, I would have been one of the other disciples that sat back and said, let's just see what happens to Peter, you know? So the way I see it, Peter already had quite a bit of faith as it is to be able to step out of the boat in the first place. Now, it's true that his faith failed him and that he sank, right? But I want you to pay attention to something else here. When he reached out his hand, Jesus reached out his hand and he pulled Peter out of the water and they got back into the boat, what happened? I'm testing your Sunday school skills. Don't answer Josiah or Violet. The storm ceased, okay? And then what happened? Don't look in your Bibles. They worshiped him. Okay. Now, why is this important? All right. Let's look at, in the Old Testament, there's a lot of things that are back there that are very useful for us. Where I'm going to go today is in Psalms chapter 77. I win. I got there first. But I had it marked, so that doesn't count. So, Psalms chapter 77. See, the Israelites, the Jews would have known, had a specific idea in mind. The person that controls nature is God, right? We saw the same thing with Elijah on Mount Carmel when he defeated the prophets of Baal, right? He called down fire from heaven. The other prophets couldn't do it. We see the pillar of fire. We see the pillar of smoke by God during the day and night. We see the parting of the Red Sea. We see the parting of the Jordan. All these things that have happened. We see all the plagues that were of nature that happened to Egypt, right? And so we know that from a Jewish perspective, they would have understood the one that controls nature is God, right? So this is what it says in Psalm 77. I'm going to focus from 16 onward. Now this particularly is talking about the parting of the Red Sea, but I like the way the psalmist writes this. The waters saw you, O God, and the waters saw you, and they were in anguish. The deep also trembled, and the clouds poured out water, and the skies gave forth sound. Your arrows went here and there, and the sound of your thunder was in the whirlwind. The lightnings lit up the world, and the earth trembled and shook. And here's what I think is really cool. Your way was in the sea, your path was in the mighty waters, but your footprints were not known, and you led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. You see, these are passages. There's more of them throughout the Old Testament. But whenever the disciples saw that Jesus got into the boat and it was calm, that doesn't help me, and it was calm, something happened in their mind that all of a sudden they realized, no, this isn't just a prophet. This isn't just a man of God. This is God in flesh. And that's why they worshiped him in the boat. Now there's a point that I want to make here. That's enough as it is. I mean, that's a pretty good point. But after we get out, go back to Matthew, if you would. Matthew chapter 14 again. From here, we see at the end of the chapter that they get out of the boat, they get on the land, word goes out that Jesus is back over here, and everyone flocks over to him so they can get healed. Okay? Now, from the perspective of Matthew, the reason that he's writing this, that's as far as he needs to go. But each one of the gospel writers has their own purpose and their own audience that they're trying to write. So if we want to know chronologically what happens next in the story, we can't stay in Matthew. We have to go over to the book of John. Okay? So you can see that yourself, though. Stops right there. The next chapter, I'm in the wrong spot. That would help if I was in the right one. Okay, it goes on to another portion. So go over to John chapter 6. Now you can see that John chapter 6 in verse 15 is John's account of when Jesus walks on water. But afterwards, I'm going to just kind of summarize the things that took place, but there's a specific statement here that I want you guys to hear. After this, when Jesus got out of the boat, people came back over because they were looking for Jesus to perform more miracles. Okay? They had just seen the feeding of the 5,000, people got fed, right? And so they actually tested Jesus and said, Moses gave us manna out of heaven, what are you going to give us? And Jesus said, a wicked, adulterous generation seeks after a sign, those types of things. Eventually, we get to a point where Jesus talks about what we call today communion, the breaking of bread and the blood. And he makes the statement that you cannot follow him unless you eat his flesh and drink his blood. And that statement was revolting to all of the Jews. The idea of cannibalism was disgusting to them. And it actually says here, we're going to start in, let's see where I want to start. Well, I have in verse 66. The teaching was very hard for them, so a lot of them left. A lot of the ones that were following Jesus left at that point. And then we're starting in verse 66. All right. As a result of this, many of his disciples went away and were not walking with him anymore. So Jesus said to the 12, "Do you also want to go?" And Simon Peter said, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life, and we have come to believe and have come to know that you are the Holy One of God." See, there is something that they experienced, something that God had done in their life, something that made it to where everything else didn't matter. Where else were they going to go? They made this profession of faith there when everyone else was saying, you know what, we can't do this. This is too much for us. They stayed. And now, does anybody here know what happened to the apostles, after Christ? And we have the books of the New Testament that were written by Paul and Peter and James and stuff like that. We know that Paul, he was crucified upside down according to legend or according to history. Peter, upside down. Paul was beheaded. The most gruesome that I know of was Bartholomew. I think that was who it was. He was skinned alive. Each one of these people went to their grave knowing what Jesus had done, because they didn't just know what he did, they knew who he was. Jesus was God, and if Jesus was God, then where else would you rather be? At the time when they were going through the storm in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus had not yet come walking to them on the water, I'm sure that they wished that they were anywhere else except in that boat. I'm pretty sure that if anyone were to stop everything and go, "Hey, would you rather be on land?" I think every single one of them would have said, "Yeah, this is not a good place to be." After knowing what Christ did and who Christ was, I don't think any one of them would have gotten out of the boat. Because the storm is where Christ had put them to prepare them for what they needed in the future. And what they were going to be facing in the future was a lot harder than just sitting in a boat. We know Paul was shipwrecked for days. We know that he was scourged, beaten. He was put in prison, and eventually lost his head because of Christ. But never once did he question whether or not he should do it. So, what should I do first, Mary? That's the first time I've asked you that question. Put it on the spot. I'll tell you why we're sharing this particular message. It has some things that we have learned while we were in Thailand, right after we got there. He's not in here right now, so I can talk about him. Our second youngest son is named Matthias. He was born in Thailand in 2018. Matthias was we didn't think that there was anything wrong. Mary carried him full term. She had low amniotic fluid at first. So there was lots of ultrasounds and testings and making sure that he was okay. But when came time to close to his due date, he was past due. He ended up going over, I think it was 10 days. Sure. And Mary has an issue. She did not want to go in, and she didn't want to be induced. She wanted to have the baby naturally and just leave all that stuff out of it. The reason is, in Thailand, the way that they induce patients or mothers is they don't, in the States, they just put an IV in and they drip it slowly. And eventually it gets worse and worse until you have the baby. In Thailand, the nurse walked in with a large syringe and just stuck her and shoved it all in at once and said, "See you in a minute." And so Mary dreaded this induction. Is it induction? Inducing? Yeah. Well, not, but there's more backstory to it. With Violet, she was a special case, not because anything happened during pregnancy, except for from the time that Mary went into labor, I put her in the truck and I started driving to the hospital. It was 15 minutes away. Got to the hospital. Violet was born 20 minutes later, before the doctor could get into the delivery room. So the doctor in Thailand took all of the history of Mary and all of the kids that she's had. Matthias was our fourth child. And so we expected that Matthias was going to be born quickly. So that's fine, but our house at the time was about 45 minutes, 30 to 45 minutes away from the hospital that we needed to be in, which wasn't a big deal. I watched some YouTube videos on how to, and we actually had a ministry that gave us a backpack with a shower curtain and gloves and some scissors. It wasn't, and told me basically what to do. And I thought, if this happens, it's going to go in a newsletter and it's going to be great. And so I was prepared. I thought it was anyways. We show up for Mary's appointment. They did an ultrasound and did a test, and she came back with Group B strep. Does anyone know what that is? Yeah, it's not a dangerous thing for mothers. It's a common thing amongst women and I guess men too. But it can prove to be a problem for babies if they're delivered. They can develop complications later. So now our plans changed because Mary had to be in the hospital so that she could get an IV and antibiotics for so many hours prior to delivery, which really bummed her out because that meant that she was going to have to be induced. So we get to the hospital. She gets this is also during COVID. No, this is prior to COVID. The next kid was the COVID kid. So we get to the hospital. Mary's in the room. They got her hooked up, started with the antibiotics, and then gave her the induction medicine and said, "Don't worry, the doctor's on their way." And Mary stopped the nurse and she told me, she said, "You need to tell the nurse that the baby's coming now." And the lady said, "Oh," I remember it very clearly. And I remember it was not, she said, "Oh, jayin," which means be patient. And I saw my lovely wife. She's very nice, very kind. And she looked at me and she goes, "I'm going to prove this lady wrong." And she delivered Matthias on her own. And the lady was standing against the wall and her eyes were this big. And she said, and the baby, he was there. Well, he was blue, didn't really have the right colors to him. The nurse came over a second later after she realized that she was supposed to do a job. He was having trouble breathing, so she took a suction tube and put it down his throat, and it came back out. It went down and came back out. And they kept doing it, couldn't figure it out. Ended up having to go get the doctor, another doctor, came back in, wheeled him off over to the NICU. And we're trying to figure out what's going on. So the doctor finally came over, and the way they are in Thailand, they like to, better just stop my watch because that's not going to help me. They like to, even if you can speak Thai, they like to speak English if they can. And sometimes they use Thai, but I'm not really good at Thai medical terms, so it wouldn't necessarily help me out anyways. But they kept saying that his throat was a pouch. And I said, "Just poke it out." That was evidently what happened. He had a condition called esophageal atresia. His esophagus stopped here. It was a pouch, and it didn't go down into his stomach. Instead, another part of it grew over and connected to his trach. And then the trach grew out into his stomach. So he was taken to NICU. We looked up what esophageal atresia was, and Google did a great job of putting us at, no. Google said that all we got was mortality rate. And so we got a little bit nervous. Turns out we were in the hospital that we should have been, because they're the only hospital in the city that has a NICU, just right there attached to it. We ended up getting a surgeon, and we didn't think anything of it, just a surgeon. Coming to find out, it's the only pediatric surgeon in the northern half of the country that can do the surgery. Not only that, but she was the best pediatric surgeon in the country. When people asked, "Who did you get to do the job or the surgery?" We said, "Oh, it's Dr. Nanny." And they go, You would never get Dr. Nanny. So sometime later, after we had some reflecting time, we realized that God had blessed us more than we thought originally. And I came to this conclusion: God blessed us with Group B strep. Because he came so quickly. I mean, granted, they did do an induction, but he came so quickly that it probably would have been a car delivery. What is the first thing that you do after you have a baby, moms? Or dads? I mean, you guys can answer too. You usually feed the baby, right? If Mary would have fed Matthias after birth, he would have drowned because it went into his lungs. God saved Matthias's life by giving him Group B strep, so we were exactly where we needed to be so that we could get the help that he needed. Now, the question that arises is, well, couldn't God have prevented Matthias from having this condition in the first place? He could have, yeah. But first and foremost, the reason that he did this, in my opinion, from what I can gather from Scripture, is one, when we're done, we glorify God for how he was able to take care of us, even without us knowing. So first and foremost, it's for God's glory. Two, we can see that even though we went into this, we didn't know a thing about this going in. Actually, her OBGYN was amazed because that morning she had an ultrasound. I keep pointing at her like she's part of the conversation. Her did an ultrasound, and they said they should have seen this condition and been prepared for it. But in the weeks following up, we had like 4 or 5 ultrasounds, never saw it. We didn't know there was a condition to pray for. We didn't know that there was a problem that we were going to face that we needed help with. God took care of it without us. And because of that, I can rest in the fact that God will provide for us, even if we don't know we need it. So now what I'm going to do is we're going to do the video. And the video shows a little bit of Matthias and kind of the situation that we've been in over the past 5 years. Some of the stuff on here has to do with so you'll see pollution. Chiang Mai, where we lived in Thailand, has the highest pollution in the world. Before we left, we had it over 999 on the AQI charts. It was the only thing Thailand could place first in. So we also have the Matthias stuff, and then later on we'll get into the other work that we're actually doing with translation work and evangelism and discipleship. So after that, then we'll do questions and talking about those things a little bit more specifically. All right, thanks. You see that road, Murray? There it is.
Oh.
I just need to see where it is so I can make sure I don't drive off the mountain.
So the 4th, that's when people start heading out. That's what I was wondering about our camping. I was thinking about going after the 4th because I figured people are going to go camping on the 1st, and I figured they'd lead out by the... Whoa. Should have brought a regular camera.
A long time to wave goodbye.
Yeah, wood dog. I took a video of the kids up there. It literally looks like a storyboard.
So there's the road over there. You see where we're going. Hello everybody, this is the Silkwoods. We are at Suandong Hospital. This is the big government hospital in Chiang Mai. It's also the hospital where everybody comes for medical school. And what I'm getting here is a panoramic view of at least half of the total facilities. I won't show you everything because there's people on the balcony, but over there is the rest of it. In the way back you see the mall, one of the old malls. And I'll show you inside real quick. Hello, Mary. There's Matthias. Can you say hi, Matthias? There you go. That's close enough. He's a little tired. There's the bed. They don't have a baby bed in here, so we have a portable high chair that we grab him in, surrounded by pillows. That way he doesn't fall out of the bed. Door behind me. Here's the rest of the room. This is their semi-private room. I have a picture of the ward that we were in before to see if they had a room like this for us. But the ward had 6 beds in it. No bed for Mary, just a crib for Matthias and chairs similar to that one for Mary to sit in all night. So we got this semi-private room so that she could actually have a bed to lay down in, and she'll have to lay with Matthias.
มายืนยันตัวตนกับเจ้าหน้าที่ครับแต่ว่าบางคนใจมีตาภรรยาของเราไม่ต้องทำแค่ที่อยู่อย่างนี้เรื่อยมาค่าเช่าก็แพงขึ้นน้ำมันแพงกันราคาวันนี้ครับ200 กว่าคนทำแค่ยาเป็นแต่ร้าย
So that's a brief overview of kind of what it's been for the past 5 years. If anyone's followed us with our newsletters and stuff, we were in Chiang Mai, but we never actually wanted to work in Chiang Mai. But visa situations and trying to get to another part of the country is complicated. So we were in Chiang Mai doing work, and that's where Matthias was born. And then we got stuck in Chiang Mai because Matthias had to go through 2 years of medical treatments to make sure that his throat, he actually had one time where he was in the back seat of the truck in his car seat, and he got a hold of a piece of paper or something and swallowed it, and his throat was so narrow it got stuck in his throat. He ended up in the hospital for a day and a half. It was paper. And so they thought they're going to have to go and do surgery or something to get this thing out of his throat. And the next morning, the doctor walked in and said, if he doesn't come out, we have to admit him into the hospital longer and do more stuff. And he coughed, and it came out on the spot. So he got to go home. But it made it to where we couldn't go far from the hospital that had the ability to do the dilation for his throat. So that took 2 years. As soon as that was almost done, we had one more appointment just for a checkup. COVID happened, and they locked down everything. And when I mean lockdown, I mean we couldn't go to restaurants, we couldn't go to 7-Eleven or the corner store, we couldn't go to the market, we couldn't go to grocery stores. We definitely couldn't leave the province. So that just freed up. That lasted almost 3 years. So finally, that opened up. And The last part that you saw was Udon. That's where we just moved to. That's on the other side of the country. In Chiang Mai, it's the most populated province in the country for Christianity. There's more Christians in Chiang Mai than any other province. In fact, if you take all the Christians in Chiang Mai, it's about 100,000 or so estimated, and there's 22 provinces in the eastern part of the country where we moved. And the one province of Chiang Mai is 100,000. All 22 provinces on the other side of the country have less than half, if you combine them all. So lots of work going on in Chiang Mai. That's great. We're happy that they're there, but we wanted to be someplace else. So we moved to Udon. It's about 10 hours east. And we know of 6 churches, and we don't know of any churches that are actually, solid churches. They're kind of churches. So we're excited to be able to get over there and start working. The things that we mentioned, there's a translation project. A lot of the preachers and stuff that are coming out of some of the Bible schools in Thailand aren't trained very well. They don't really know how to do their work. There's a story I was telling David last night. Some of these pastors get out of Bible school. There's a church out in the middle of nowhere. They really need a pastor, but they don't have one. Guy comes in and interviews. They want the job, but they say, oh, I want this much money. I want this, 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 and this. And these little farmers go, well, we can pay you some cash, but not that much. They want like 10,000 baht. And they say, well, we can give you 500. But we'll give you a place to stay, and we'll give you, you'll never have to go hungry because we'll give you all your food, and we'll take care of you like a village does. And these pastors say, no, I want the money. And so they leave. So our goal is to, when we get into Udon area, is to work with these new pastors coming out and kind of train them a little bit more on how to do pastoral care, how to lead your church. Also teach them how to be bivocational so they can do a little bit more of their own work and not rely so much on just their money from the congregation. The translation that we did is a book called Knowing Scripture, and that's pretty simple. We read it when we were our first year at Bible college. It just kind of teaches you how to interpret Scripture without ending up in the weeds and getting heretical, which is important because there's a lot of churches in Thailand that are. The other thing that we do, our main thing that we do though, is what we call personal discipleship and evangelism. We just live, our kids are involved. We go down to restaurants, we get to know our neighbors, we go to coffee shops, we get to know the people that are there, we build relationships with them, and we invite them and share the gospel that way. And then we just got the house that we have in Udon. It's a bigger house, it's an old house, and it has tons of problems that we have to fix. But it has rooms that are big enough that we can have 30, 40 people in there if we need to. So one of the ways that we do it, Mary's a good baker. Thais love baked goods, but they don't bake because they don't have ovens. They have tabletop stoves. So Mary, the one thing she does, she goes and makes cookies or brownies or something like that, and she takes them to the neighbors and says, hey, we're just in the neighborhood, we want to say hi, and here's this. And every time they go, you can bake? And she says, yeah, I can bake. And they go, can you teach me? And you go, yeah, come on over. We'll spend the day in. We'll teach you how to bake, and we'll talk about Jesus. Why not? So the job that we do, actually, the actual working with people, that's easy. Talking with people about Jesus is easy. It's the life and how you have to live there and all the other stuff. It's a part-time job just to keep us legal in the country and to keep the bills paid.